This isn't a story I ever thought I'd tell, but it's the absolute truth of what happened in my family. A testament to the fact that sometimes the people closest to you are the ones holding the longest knives. The heavy oak door of the law office on State Street clicked shut, trapping the scent of old paper and fresh betrayal in the air with the four of us. Across the polished mahogany table, my Aunt Carol's fingers, adorned with a sapphire that matched her cold eyes, rested delicately on a stack of documents. My supposed medical records, as our family lawyer, a man I'd known since childhood, cleared his throat and read the words that shattered my world. And in the event that Alara Vance is deemed psychologically unstable, her portion of the inheritance shall be forfeit and absorbed by the remaining beneficiary. If you genuinely enjoy our stories, please subscribe to the channel, tell us where you're from, and what time it is right now. It's always fascinating to know how far our story flows. The lawyer, Mr. Davies, a man whose jowls sagged with the weight of decades of other people's secrets, refused to meet my gaze. He stared at a fixed point on the wall just over my shoulder, his voice a monotone drone that felt profoundly, personally insulting. My cousin, Thomas, Carol's son and the remaining beneficiary, shifted uncomfortably in his leather chair. He had the decency to look ashamed, his eyes darting from his mother to me, a silent apology he was too weak to voice. But my Aunt Carol, she was a masterpiece of performative grief. She reached a manicured hand across the table, her expression a perfect mask of sorrowful concern. "Alara, darling," she murmured, her voice like silk wrapped around a razor. "This isn't what any of us wanted. We were just so worried." I didn't take her hand. I couldn't feel my own. My blood had turned to ice water, a frigid slush pumping through my veins. All I could do was stare at the clause in the document he'd pushed toward me. The paper was thick, creamy, expensive. The kind of paper used for declarations of war and the signing away of lives. My grandfather's signature was at the bottom of the page, a familiar, spidery scrawl from 5 years ago, a year before he passed. But the codicil, the amendment containing this character assassination, it was dated just 6 months before his death. My grandfather had been sick then, weak, and Carol had been his primary caregiver, his gatekeeper. Unstable. The word felt alien in my mouth. It tasted like ash. "What are you talking about?" Carol sighed, a theatrical exhalation of manufactured patience. "Honey, we know about your struggles. Your grandfather knew. He just wanted to make sure the family legacy was protected, that you were protected from the pressures of it." She gestured to the file with her name on it. "Carol Beaumont, trustee. It's for the best. Thomas and I will make sure you're always taken care of. A modest allowance, of course. We'll handle everything." Thomas flinched at the word allowance. He knew, as I did, what the trust was worth. My grandfather, Arthur Vance, hadn't just been wealthy. He'd built a manufacturing empire from the ground up. The Vance Trust was the kind of fortune that reshaped skylines. My half was supposed to be my future, my security, the legacy of the only man who had ever truly believed in me. And here was his sister, my own flesh and blood, snatching it away with a single, damning word. My struggles. I knew exactly what she meant. When I was 19, a sophomore at Boston University, my parents had been killed in a pileup on the I-93. The grief was a tidal wave that nearly drowned me. I'd had panic attacks. I'd seen a therapist for 2 years. I'd taken medication for a while to help me sleep, to quiet the roaring in my head. My grandfather had paid for all of it. He'd sat with me for hours in his dusty study on Beacon Hill, not saying a word, just being a solid, comforting presence until the tremors subsided. He called my therapy getting the engine checked. He called my anxiety a temporary storm. He never, not once, made me feel broken. He made me feel human. Carol, on the other hand, had always treated it like a fascinating, exotic flaw. She would corner me at family holidays, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "How are you really doing, Alara? Are you sleeping? You seem a bit high-strung, darling. Are you remembering to take your little pills?" It was never concern. It was data collection. And I, in my naive grief, had given her all the data she needed. Mr. Davies cleared his throat again, a nervous, gravelly sound. The documentation provided by Ms. Beaumont is quite thorough. Letters from concerned family friends, notations of erratic behavior, a psychiatric evaluation. Eh, what? My voice was sharp, cutting through the funereal quiet. I've never had a psychiatric evaluation. Carol's mask of sympathy tightened. Oh, sweetie. You did. You just don't remember. Her eyes held mine, and in their depths, I saw a flicker of something terrifying, triumph. She had me. She had a piece of paper from a doctor I'd never met, diagnosing a condition I didn't have, and she was using it to steal my life from me. The lie was so audacious, so complete, that it was perversely brilliant. How do you fight a shadow? How do you prove you're sane when the very act of protesting your sanity is seen as proof of your instability? I looked from her smug, pitying face to her son's guilty one, to the lawyer's averted eyes. I was utterly, completely alone. They had built a cage of whispers and forged documents around me, and the door had just been locked. I stood up, my chair scraping harshly against the floor. The sound was a violation in the hallowed silence of the room. I didn't shout. I didn't cry. I pulled a shard of composure from the wreckage inside me and looked directly at my aunt. This isn't over, Carol, I said, my voice low and steady, a promise that felt more real than anything else in the room. She smiled, a tiny, barely perceptible curl of her lips. It was the smile of a chess player who had just said checkmate. Of course it's not, dear, she said, her tone dripping with condescension. It's just beginning. Your new, simpler life. I walked out of that office and into the cold Boston afternoon, the city noise a dull roar in my ears. The world felt tilted on its axis. Every person I passed on the sidewalk seemed to be looking at me, judging me, whispering the word unstable. Carol hadn't just stolen my inheritance. She had stolen my identity. She had taken my grief, my vulnerability, and twisted it into a weapon to be used against me. And as I stood on the edge of the Boston Common, the wind whipping tears from my eyes, a new feeling began to smolder in the icy pit of my stomach. It wasn't despair. It was rage. A cold, clear, calculating rage. She thought she was at the beginning of her victory. She had no idea she was at the beginning of a war. She had underestimated the girl who had survived the storm. A storm was exactly what I was going to become. The first few days were a blur of helpless fury. I went back to my apartment in the South End, a beautiful brownstone flat my grandfather had helped me buy, and paced the hardwood floors like a caged animal. Every object seemed to mock me. The antique writing desk he'd given me for graduation. The first edition copy of Moby Dick he'd bought me from the Brattle bookshop. His entire life was woven into the fabric of mine, and Carol was trying to cut the thread. I barely slept. When I did, my dreams were haunted by the image of her triumphant smile. I'd wake up with my heart pounding, the words psychologically unstable, echoing in the dark. It was a perfect trap. The more I fought, the more I raged, the more I would seem to confirm her diagnosis. Any emotional display would be twisted into another symptom. I was cornered. But my grandfather didn't raise a victim. He was a fighter. He'd built his company from a small machine shop in Somerville into a global powerhouse through sheer force of will. He used to tell me, "Ellie, when your back's against the wall, don't push back. Find a way to knock the damn wall down." So, on the fourth day, I stopped pacing and I started thinking. I made a pot of coffee so strong it could dissolve steel and sat down at that antique desk. I took out a legal pad and drew a line down the middle. On one side, I wrote Carol's case. On the other, my reality. Under Carol's case, I listed what I knew. The fabricated psychiatric evaluation was the linchpin. Then there were the letters from concerned friends and notations of erratic behavior. Who were these friends? What was this behavior? It had to be a tapestry of half-truths and outright lies, woven together so skillfully that it looked like a shroud. Carol was a master of social manipulation. She could turn a simple bad day into a depressive episode, a passionate argument into a sign of emotional volatility. My artistic temperament, my love for painting, for losing myself in music, could be painted as a disconnection from reality. Under my reality, I started writing. I listed every success, Every accomplishment since I'd finished therapy years ago. Graduating magna cum laude. The promotion I'd earned at the marketing firm I worked for. The stable, loving relationships I had. The charity work I did on weekends. I was building a portrait of a person who was the complete opposite of the one Carol had painted. But a portrait isn't proof. It's a story. I needed evidence. My first call was to Dr. Albright, my old therapist. She was a kind, no-nonsense woman with a calming presence. I explained the situation, my voice trembling slightly as I recounted the meeting at the lawyer's office. "Alara, that's outrageous," she said, her voice sharp with indignation. "And for the record, it's also highly illegal. I have never, ever released your records to anyone, nor have I ever spoken to your aunt about your sessions. Patient confidentiality is absolute." "She claims to have a psychiatric evaluation," I said. "Then it's a forgery," Dr. Albright stated flatly. "And any doctor who would sign such a thing without ever meeting you should have his license revoked." "Is there a name on the report?" "I didn't see it. Davies just skimmed it." "Get the name, Alara. Find out who signed that paper. That's your first loose thread. Pull on it." That single conversation was like a match in a dark room. For the first time, I had a tangible objective. Find the name of the doctor. But how? Mr. Davies was Carol's man. He would never willingly give me a copy of that file. I'd have to force his hand. Legally. This brought me to my next, more terrifying realization. I needed a lawyer. Not a family lawyer steeped in the old money traditions of Boston, but a shark. Someone young, hungry, and not afraid to get their hands dirty. I spent the next 2 days buried in research, scrolling through legal websites, reading reviews, looking for a litigator who specialized in trust and estate fraud. I found her on a Tuesday. Jessica Riley. Her firm was a small, sleek operation in the Seaport District, a world away from the stuffy, wood-paneled offices of Davies and Finch. Her online profile was formidable. A graduate of Harvard Law, she'd made a name for herself taking on cases against entrenched financial institutions. Her photo showed a woman in her mid-30s with sharp eyes and a determined set to her jaw. She looked like she ate men like Mr. Davies for breakfast. I booked a consultation. Walking into her office felt like stepping into the future. Glass walls, minimalist furniture, a panoramic view of Boston Harbor. Jessica Riley was even more intimidating in person. She listened to my entire story without interruption, her fingers steepled, her intelligent eyes never leaving my face. I laid it all out, the grief, the therapy, Carol's insidious questions, the meeting, the forged evaluation. When I finished, she was silent for a long moment. I felt a familiar prickle of dread. Maybe she thought I was unstable. Maybe the story was too outlandish to be believed. Then she leaned forward, a predatory gleam in her eyes. "Your aunt is either very stupid or very arrogant," she said, her voice crisp. "My bet is on arrogant. Arrogant people make mistakes. Our job is to find them. First things first, we file a motion to compel. We demand a copy of every single document in that file your aunt submitted. The evaluation, the letters, her notations. Everything. Mr. Davies will be legally obligated to provide them." "He'll fight it," I said. "Let him," Jessica said with a thin smile. "The more he fights to hide the evidence, the more guilty his client looks to a judge. We also subpoena your records from Dr. Albright to establish a baseline of your actual therapeutic history. We'll depose everyone. Carol, Thomas, the doctor who signed that evaluation. We will put them under oath, and we will break them." For the first time in over a week, I felt like I could breathe again. The rage was still there, but now it had a direction. It had a purpose. It had a weapon, and her name was Jessica Riley. The initial retainer fee was staggering, forcing me to liquidate a portion of my own savings, but it was a small price to pay for the chance to reclaim my life. While Jessica prepared the legal assault, she gave me a job. "You know your family better than I do. Who are these concerned friends? Go through your aunt's circle. Who is loyal to her? Who is indebted to her? Who might she have manipulated into writing a letter?" So I became a detective in my own life. I scrolled through years of Carol's ostentatious social media posts. Charity galas at the Museum of Fine Arts, summer parties in the Hamptons, ski trips to Aspen. Her circle was a who's who of Boston's elite. I made a list of her closest friends, the women she played tennis with at the country club in Brookline, the ones who sat on her charity boards. One name jumped out at me, Marion Caldwell. Marion had always been off. A sycophant who clung to Carol's side, her praise always a little too loud, her laughter a little too forced. I remembered a few years back, Marion's husband had a disastrous business venture, and there were whispers that they were on the verge of financial ruin. Then suddenly everything was fine. A new car, a lavish home renovation. Had Carol bailed them out? Was a defamatory letter about me the price of that bailout? It was a theory, but I had no proof. My investigation felt like grasping at smoke. The real battle would begin when we got those documents. The motion was filed. A week later, as expected, Mr. Davies filed a motion to quash, citing my fragile mental state and the potential for psychological harm if I were to see the contents of the file. Jessica was ecstatic. "He's playing right into our hands," she crowed over the phone. "He's trying to use the very thing we're fighting against as his legal shield. A judge is going to see right through that." She was right. The probate court judge, a sharp, discerning woman named Helen Cho, was not impressed by the argument. She granted our motion. Davies had 10 business days to turn over the entire file. The day the file arrived at Jessica's office was electric. It came in a large banker's box. We sat at her conference table, the box between us like some kind of malevolent Pandora's box. Jessica sliced it open with a letter opener. Inside were meticulously organized folders. The top one was labeled Psychiatric Evaluation. I held my breath as Jessica opened it. The report was 4 pages long, on the letterhead of a Dr. Alastair Finch. It was filled with clinical jargon, describing a patient with classic markers of borderline personality disorder, emotional dysregulation, and a tenuous grasp on reality. It was a portrait of a stranger. My name was on it, but it wasn't me. "Never heard of him," I whispered, my hands shaking. "I have," Jessica said, her voice grim as she typed the name into her laptop. She turned the screen toward me. "Dr. Alastair Finch had his license suspended 2 years ago for insurance fraud and writing fraudulent prescriptions. He was an 80-year-old quack who had lost his credentials. Carol had likely paid him a handsome sum for this work of fiction." "This is good," Jessica said, a grim satisfaction in her tone. "This is very good. A discredited doctor. We can tear this apart on the stand." But the next folders were what truly turned my stomach. There were copies of emails I'd sent to my grandfather during my darkest days in college, emails where I'd poured my heart out about my grief and anxiety. Carol must have gotten into his account after he died. She had taken my pain and curated it, presenting it as evidence. There were printouts of my own social media posts. A picture of a beautifully melancholic painting I'd admired at the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum was annotated with a handwritten note from Carol. "Obsession with morbid imagery." A photo of me at a friend's bachelorette party in New Orleans, smiling and holding a drink, was labeled "Tendencies toward manic hedonism." And then there were the letters. 6 of them. From her friends, including, as I had suspected, Marion Caldwell. They were masterpieces of passive aggression, filled with phrases like, "We are all so concerned for dear Alara," and her behavior at the fundraiser was so theatrical. They described incidents that were either completely fabricated or so twisted out of context as to be unrecognizable. An argument I'd had with a caterer about a nut allergy was reframed as a public outburst. A period of quiet introspection after a breakup was described as a frightening withdrawal from society. It was my entire life, rewritten by my worst enemy. I felt physically ill. This was Carol's power. She wasn't just a liar, she was a brilliant, malevolent storyteller. She had created a fictional version of me that was just plausible enough to be believed by those who wanted to believe it. Her power was the power of the narrative. She controlled the story, and in Boston's high society, the story was everything. The family, my cousins, my uncles, they had all heard Carol's version of the story for years. Her whispers at parties, her concerned phone calls. She had been poisoning the well for a decade. The legal fight would be brutal. Jessica was confident we could discredit Finch and challenge the letters, but it would be a long, ugly public spectacle. My personal life, my past grief, would be dissected in a courtroom. Carol would play the part of the concerned matriarch, trying to protect her troubled niece. Even if we won, the stain of her accusations might never fully wash away. I'd always be the niece who was accused of being unstable. Carol would lose the money, but she'd still damage my reputation, which was perhaps her goal all along. I looked at the mountain of lies on the conference table, at the sneering, condescending tone in every letter. I thought of my grandfather's trust, his belief in me. He wouldn't want me to just win. He would want me to annihilate her. A legal victory wasn't enough. I needed more. I needed a confession. That evening, I sat in my apartment, the city lights twinkling outside my window, and a new plan began to form. A terrifying, risky, and utterly necessary plan. The legal battle would be the stage, but the real war would be fought on my terms. Carol had used whispers and lies to build her case. I would use her own voice to tear it down. She thought she was untouchable, wrapped in a cocoon of wealth and social influence. It was time to show her how fragile that cocoon really was. The shift inside me was seismic. The vulnerable, wounded young woman who had walked out of that law office was gone. In her place was someone cold, focused, and utterly relentless. Jessica was my lawyer, my weapon in the courtroom. But this was personal. I was going to beat Carol at her own game. I wouldn't just defend myself against her story. I would become the author of her ending. The plan was simple in its concept, but terrifyingly complex in its execution. I needed to get Carol to admit on tape that she had fabricated the entire unstable narrative. To do that, I had to bypass every defense mechanism she had. I couldn't approach her as an adversary. I had to approach her as a defeated, broken victim. I had to play the very role she had written for me. First, I had to set the stage. I started by instructing Jessica to send a low-ball settlement offer to Carol's lawyer. Something laughably small. A tiny fraction of my inheritance in exchange for dropping our lawsuit. It was designed to do one thing: signal weakness. Jessica hated it. This makes us look like we're scared, Alara. Like we know our case is weak. Exactly, I told her. I want her to think I'm on the ropes. I want her to get overconfident. Arrogant people, remember? Reluctantly, she agreed. As we'd predicted, Mr. Davies rejected the offer almost immediately, his response dripping with condescension. The message was clear. They thought they had already won. Next, I began to recede. I stopped posting on social media. When mutual acquaintances called, I sounded withdrawn and sad. I let the rumors Carol had started fester. Friends would call me tentatively. "Hey, I heard, is everything okay?" And I would sigh and say, "It's just a lot right now. She's making things very difficult." I was planting seeds of my own, framing the narrative not as me being unstable, but as me being crushed under the weight of a powerful relative's bullying. The final piece of stagecraft was Thomas, her son. I'd always had a decent relationship with my cousin. He was weak-willed and dominated by his mother, but I didn't believe he was malicious. He was a pawn, and his guilt was my way in. I called him, my voice cracking with carefully rehearsed emotion. "Thomas, I'm not calling to fight. I need to talk." We met for coffee at a small cafe on Newberry Street, a place we used to go with my grandfather. He looked terrible, dark circles under his eyes. "Alara, I'm so sorry," he mumbled into his latte. "My mother, she gets an idea in her head." "I'm going to lose everything, Thomas," I said, letting a tear slip down my cheek. I hated myself for the manipulation, but the stakes were too high. I can't fight her. She's too strong. The lawyers, her friends. I'm done. I'm going to give up. He looked relieved and horrified at the same time. "Don't say that. Maybe I can talk to her." "No," I said, grabbing his hand. "Don't. It'll only make it worse. But there is one thing. Before I sign the papers, I need to understand why. I want to meet with her. Just the two of us. No lawyers. I need to hear it from her. As family. Will you ask her for me? Tell her I'm ready to surrender. I just want peace." It was the perfect bait. An appeal to her ego. The chance for a final, triumphant victory lap where her broken niece would beg for understanding. Thomas, desperate to alleviate his own conscience, agreed immediately. 2 days later, he called back. "She'll meet you. The Oak Room at the Fairmont Copley Plaza. Tomorrow at 3. The Oak Room. Of course. It was her power place. Dark wood, hushed tones, the scent of old money. A place where she felt untouchable. The next 24 hours were the longest of my life. I went to a high-end spy shop in Cambridge, the kind of place that caters to private investigators and paranoid millionaires. I bought a digital audio recorder so small it was almost invisible, disguised as a modern minimalist silver brooch. The audio quality was astonishing. It could pick up a clear conversation from across a room, filtering out background noise. I practiced all night. I practiced the walk of a defeated person, the slump of the shoulders, the downcast eyes. I practiced the tremor in my voice. I had to be utterly convincing. There would be no second chances. The next day I dressed the part. No power suit. I wore a simple gray cashmere sweater, jeans, and minimal makeup. I looked pale and exhausted, which wasn't hard to fake. I pinned the silver brooch to my sweater, right over my heart. I touched it. The small, cold piece of metal was my only weapon. I arrived at the Fairmont Copley Plaza exactly on time. The Oak Room was as imposing as I remembered. Carol was already there, seated at a secluded corner booth, a glass of Chardonnay in her hand. She looked magnificent, exuding a regal calm. She had won, and she was dressed for the coronation. "Elara," she said, her voice smooth. She gestured to the seat opposite her. "Thank you for coming. I'm glad you've decided to be sensible." I slid into the booth, my hands clasped tightly in my lap to hide their trembling. "Aunt Carol," I began, my voice a near whisper. I looked up at her, my eyes wide and pleading. "I'm not here to fight. I'm done. You win. You were right. I can't handle this. I'll sign whatever you want." A slow, satisfied smile spread across her face. It was the same smile from the law office. The smile of absolute victory. "I'm so glad to hear you say that, dear. It's for the best. Truly." "I know," I said, forcing a pathetic little sob. "I just have to ask, why? Why did you do it? Was it really because you were worried about me?" This was the critical moment. I was appealing to her narcissism, giving her the chance to monologue, to explain her brilliant, benevolent plan. She took a delicate sip of her wine. "Worry was a part of it, of course," she said magnanimously. "But honestly, Elara, you were never suited for it. The money, the responsibility. It requires a certain fortitude, a strength you simply don't possess. Your father was the same way. All artists know spine. The insult to my dead father was like a slap in the face, but I absorbed it, my mask of misery firmly in place. But the evaluation? The letters? Dr. Albright said she never." Carol waved a dismissive hand, a gesture of profound arrogance. "Oh, details. Technicalities. Sometimes you have to create the reality you need. Your grandfather was a sentimental old fool. He saw you as this fragile little doll he needed to protect after your parents died. He couldn't see that leaving you that kind of fortune would have been a cruelty. I saw it. Someone had to be the adult in the room. My heart was hammering against my ribs, so loud I was sure she could hear it. I pressed my hand against the brooch, a silent prayer that the tiny machine was capturing every poisonous word. "So it wasn't true?" I whispered. "The things in those letters? The doctor?" She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial, gloating purr. It was the voice she used when she shared the most delicious gossip. Of course it wasn't true in a literal sense. Don't be so naive. It was a narrative. It was easy. A few suggestions here, a concerned letter there from a friend who owes me a favor. People believe what they want to believe about a girl who sees a shrink. You were an easy target, darling. Your history made you one. I simply gave them a story that fit the facts they already had. She sat back, smug and serene, having delivered the final, crushing blow. She thought she was explaining the rules of the world to a foolish child. She had no idea she had just handed me the axe to chop her world down. "I see," I said, my voice hollow. I let the silence hang in the air for a moment, letting her savor her confession. Thank you, Carol, for being honest. I stood up, my legs feeling surprisingly steady. Where are you going? She asked, a flicker of annoyance in her eyes. We haven't discussed the terms of your allowance. I looked down at her, and for the first time, I let the mask drop. I let her see the cold, hard fury in my eyes. I didn't have to say a word. Her smile faltered. A sliver of confusion, of alarm, pierced through her arrogant composure. She had seen a ghost. Not the ghost of the broken girl who had just sat before her, but the ghost of her brother, Arthur Vance. She had seen his resolve in my eyes. I have another meeting to get to, I said, my voice no longer trembling. It was as cold and clear as ice. I walked out of the oak room, through the opulent hotel lobby, and into the sunlight of Copley Square. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I had her. I had her voice, her arrogance, her confession, captured on a tiny piece of silver pinned over my heart. The war wasn't over, but the final decisive battle had just been won. And my enemy didn't even know it yet. The final meeting was scheduled not in a courtroom, but in the main conference room of Davies and Finch. Carol had insisted on it. She wanted the final surrender to happen on her turf, the same room where she had first lowered the axe. It was a final act of dominance, and I was more than happy to let her have it. Jessica and I had spent the last 2 days preparing. The audio file was cleaned up by a professional sound engineer, removing the clinking of glasses and ambient chatter, isolating Carol's voice until it was terrifyingly clear. We had it transcribed and notarized. It was a thermonuclear device, and we were about to place it right in the center of her life. I walked into that conference room feeling like a completely different person from the one who had fled it weeks before. I wore a sharply tailored navy blue suit, my hair was pulled back, and my expression was a mask of calm neutrality. Jessica walked beside me, carrying a slim briefcase. Carol, Thomas, and Mr. Davies were already seated. Carol was beaming, radiating a benevolent grace as if she were about to bestow a great gift. Thomas looked miserable. Mr. Davies looked relieved, eager to have this messy business concluded. "Elara, Jessica," he began, gesturing toward the chairs. "Thank you for coming. I have the settlement documents prepared. If you'll just look them over," he slid a thick document across the table. Jessica didn't even glance at it. Instead, she opened her briefcase and took out a small, high-fidelity speaker and her laptop. She placed them in the center of the mahogany table. Carol's smile tightened. "What is this? Is there a problem?" "No problem at all," Jessica said smoothly. "We just have one final piece of evidence we'd like to present before we proceed. We believe it will greatly simplify the discussion." Mr. Davies sputtered. "Evidence? This is a settlement signing, not a hearing. All discovery is closed." "This is new evidence," Jessica said, her eyes locked on Carol. "Acquired just yesterday. I think you'll find it highly relevant." My aunt's face, for the first time, registered a flicker of uncertainty. She looked at me, searching for the broken niece she had conquered in the oak room. That girl was nowhere to be found. Jessica hit a key on her laptop. And then Carol's own voice filled the silent room. Of course it wasn't true in a literal sense. Don't be so naive. It was a narrative. The color drained from Carol's face. Thomas gasped, his eyes wide with horror. Mr. Davies' jaw went slack. The recording continued, each word a hammer blow against the foundation of their case. It was easy. A few suggestions here, a concerned letter there from a friend who owes me a favor. People believe what they want to believe about a girl who sees a shrink. "You were an easy target, darling." When the final damning line, "I simply gave them a story that fit the facts they already had," echoed in the room, the silence that followed was absolute. It was the silence of a tomb. Carol was staring at the speaker as if it were a poisonous snake. She looked like she had been turned to stone. Mr. Davies was pale, his hands trembling as he looked from me to my aunt. He knew what this meant. Fraud. Malicious prosecution. Conspiracy. It was career-ending. It was disbarment. Jessica let the silence stretch for a full 10 seconds before she spoke, her voice cutting through the tension like a scalpel. "That was a recording of a conversation between my client, and Ms. Beaumont yesterday afternoon," she stated. A conversation in which Ms. Beaumont confesses in detail to a deliberate and malicious scheme to defraud my client of her inheritance by fabricating evidence and knowingly submitting forged documents to this legal counsel and to the court. She paused, letting the weight of her words land. "Given this, we are formally withdrawing our settlement offer." She slid a new document across the table. It was thicker than the settlement agreement. "This is our new position. We are invoking the interorum or no contest clause of the Vance Trust. Typically, this clause applies to a beneficiary who challenges the trust and loses. However, we are arguing a novel application. We contend that Ms. Beaumont, through her fraudulent actions as a trustee, has mounted the most egregious challenge imaginable to the true intent of the grantor, Arthur Vance. Her actions have not only sought to disinherit a rightful beneficiary, but have done so through criminal means, thereby forfeiting her own standing as a beneficiary and a trustee." Mr. Davies was staring at the document, his face ashen. That's an aggressive interpretation." "Is it?" Jessica countered. "Would you care to argue before a judge that a trustee who commits felony fraud to steal from the trust should be allowed to continue benefiting from it? A judge, by the way, who will have this recording, a certified transcript, and our formal requests for the district attorney to investigate Ms. Beaumont, Dr. Finch, and anyone who wrote those letters for conspiracy and perjury." She gestured to me. "Mr. Vance left his estate to be shared by two people. One of them has now proven, with her own words, that she is a criminal who spat on his memory. Therefore, we contend there is only one legitimate beneficiary left. Alara Vance. We are demanding the full trust. Everything. Ms. Beaumont's share, her son's share, all of it. In exchange, and only in exchange for her immediate and permanent resignation as trustee and a full relinquishment of all claims, we will consider not forwarding this recording to the district attorney's office." It was a masterstroke. She wasn't just asking for my share back. She was using Carol's own greed and criminality against her to take everything. It was brutal. It was ruthless. It was exactly what my grandfather would have done. Carol finally found her voice. It was a strangled, pathetic rasp. "You can't." I looked at her, truly looked at her for the first time without fear or pain. I just saw a hollow, greedy woman who had been outplayed. "You made me the target," I said, my voice even. "You made me the story. Now this is the story. The one you wrote. The one where the greedy aunt gets nothing. Sign the papers, Carol." Thomas was openly weeping now, a quiet, shuddering sound. Mr. Davies, seeing his entire professional life flashing before his eyes, picked up a pen and pushed the new documents in front of Carol. "Sign it, Carol," he urged, his voice tight with panic. "For God's sake, sign it." And she did. Her hand shook so violently she could barely form the letters of her name. She signed away her fortune, her power, her place in the family. She signed away her entire world. When it was done, Jessica and I stood up. We gathered our things. I didn't look at her again. I didn't need to. I had already won. As we walked toward the door, I paused and looked back at my cousin. "Thomas," I said, "I'll be in touch." It was the only olive branch I was willing to extend. He was weak, but perhaps not evil. His fate was yet to be written. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of legal transfers. Carol disappeared. I heard she sold her house on Beacon Hill and moved to a small condo in Florida. Her friends, the ones who had written the letters, shunned her completely. In her world, getting caught was a far greater sin than the crime itself. I was now the sole beneficiary of the Vance Trust, the steward of my grandfather's entire legacy. The weight of it was immense, but for the first time, I felt strong enough to carry it. I now live in my grandfather's house. I run the foundation he established. From the window of his old study, I can look out over the Boston Common, watching the seasons change. The fortune is a tool, a responsibility, but it is not the prize. The prize was getting my name back. The prize was taking the story she tried to write about me and burning it to the ground. I never saw my aunt again, but sometimes when the wind blows just right off the Charles River, I can almost hear her whispering that I'm unstable, And I just smile because for the first time in my life, I know she's absolutely right. The end.